Bombshell news from the Financial Times. The West asks Ukraine to give territory to Russia in order to join NATO on the West German model. Ukraine, within the borders that will arise at the time of the conclusion of the agreements, will receive protection from NATO countries under Article 5 of NATO Treaty, writes the Financial Times publication. Western countries are increasingly discussing a plan under which Ukraine would have to give up claims to some territory it lost to Russia in exchange for NATO membership. This is reported by the British newspaper Financial Times, citing sources with knowledge of the matter. According to the newspaper's information, Kiev's allies believe that substantial security guarantees could be the basis for resolving the conflict. At the same time, the plan under discussion assumes that Russia will retain control over the territories it now holds. Ukraine, within the borders that will arise at the time of the conclusion of the agreements, will receive protection from NATO countries under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. The West German model. Financial Times reports that such a plan has been discussed in foreign policy circles for more than 18 months. The publication calls this model West German, since before German reunification, the western part of the country was part of NATO and the eastern part belonged to the Warsaw Pact, that is the USSR. However, the paper notes that the US is opposed, fearing that Western countries will be drawn into the conflict. So there is no silver bullet. On September 30th, former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that a peace settlement in Ukraine should include conditions for security guarantees for Ukraine from Western countries. In his opinion, Western countries led by the USA must provide Ukraine with such security guarantees that the cost of resuming the war will be very high. Stoltenberg also added that at the moment there is no silver bullet that can change the course of a special military operation. The example of Finland. In addition, Stoltenberg admitted in an interview with the Financial Times that Ukraine must be forced to abandon territories it lost during the conflict with Russia. The former head of NATO claims that after the presidential elections in the US in November 5th, there will be a diplomatic initiative so that Ukraine can sit at the negotiating table with Russia. Finland fought bravely against the Soviet Union in 1939. The Finns inflicted much more damage on the Red Army than expected. The war ended with Finland losing 10% of its territory. However, afterwards, its borders were secure, Stoltenberg said, when asked what would be offered to Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky if it came to peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Important developments after the US presidential election November 5th. According to the former head of the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO that is, progress in this direction is possible after the November 5th presidential US election. After the elections, there may be a new push, a new attempt to move the diplomatic situation, but I don't think we will raise the white flag and give up, he said. There may be an attempt to change the situation on the battlefield, while at the same time we will ensure that there will be mobility in the negotiations. The decision to start negotiations belongs to Ukraine. However, we must create conditions under which they can sit at the negotiating table with the Russians, which will allow them to remain an independent state, said the Norwegian politician. Delusions about Ukraine in NATO. Stoltenberg also believes that Ukraine will be able to join NATO even if its actual borders do not coincide with those recognized by the international community. He said there are ways around it. If the will is there, the solution can always be found. However, there must be a line after crossing which Article 5 of NATO Treaty will be invoked, and Ukraine must control the entire territory up to this border, Stoltenberg said. Russia is bluffing. He also said that while he was in command of NATO, he supported providing more military aid to Kiev and breaking up Russia's red lines. He claimed that NATO members had crossed them, the red lines that is, and accused the Russian leadership of trying his bluff. There are days and weeks at the beginning of the conflict. There were days and weeks at the beginning of the conflict, especially when we had to have discussions and raise the issue of Russian red lines, he said. These actions are very dangerous, but the alternative is to provide support to Ukraine because of Russian rhetoric, which should not be taken seriously, the former NATO Secretary General emphasized. Military NATO is inferior to Russia. In the same interview, Stoltenberg admits that the European members of NATO are inferior to Russia in terms of their military potential and will have to compensate for this lag by increasing defense spending. According to him, European countries now have very few weapons, equipment, and soldiers in a state of high readiness for a possible conflict. He said, "We know we're behind the Russians. I can't tell you exactly how much it will cost to make up the backlog, but I can tell you with certainty that if the Allies are going to deliver what they promised, it will cost much more than 2% of GDP, maybe 3%, he said. According to Stoltenberg, Moscow is also aware of this state of affairs. We had to send weapons to Ukraine before 2022. Asked what he regretted most after leaving his post as the alliance's Secretary General, the Norwegian politician said that NATO should have started supplying Ukraine with lethal weapons earlier. He argued that the delivery should have taken place before the start of Russia's special military operation February 2022, but most allies were too afraid of the consequences. Stoltenberg went on to claim that sending more modern weapons to Ukraine could have prevented a conflict with Russia, or at least made it very difficult for the Russian military to carry out combat missions. He said, "If there's one thing I kind of regret and see a lot more clearly now is that we should have given Ukraine a lot more military support a lot earlier. I think we all have to admit we should have given them more weapons, more advanced and faster. I take my share of the responsibility," he pointed out. Now, the Biden-Zelensky meeting on September 26, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met in Washington with his American counterpart Joe Biden, having previously stated that he intended to discuss with him a special plan to end the conflict, a victory plan, he said, as it contains points that depend on the U.S. decisions. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken limited himself to saying only that the U.S. would study the plan proposed by Ukraine. Moscow has repeatedly criticized the so-called peace formula promoted by Ukraine as unrealistic and has pointed to the need to take into account territorial realities. Russian President Putin set the conditions for resolving the conflict, including the withdrawal of the Ukrainian army from Donbass and Novorossiya, and an explicit commitment by Kiev not to join NATO. In addition, Russia considers it necessary to lift all Western sanctions against it and to have a non-aligned and nuclear-free Ukrainian state. This is from Banking News Greece, and I've translated from Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.